touching on a daily basis as well. So how can you keep on top of all that and not feel overwhelmed? Well, for some of us, we might use like aggregating sites, the likes of dark reading or the register or bleeping computer, and try and use those to condense down what you have to learn on a regular basis. But it's still an overwhelming space. So for that reason, we actually put out a report twice a year. Our mid-year report just came out about 2 weeks ago. And that report summarizes down lots of interesting graphs and takeaways and so on about what kind of happened in that space over the 6 months. So it's a lot easier to read than going through 6 months of different research publications, right? And the data we feed this from comes from our millions of customers, from our XDR tools, our attack surface risk management, and our Vision One product. And then we complement that with underground investigations, cyber threat intelligence, and so on. So it genuinely does a good job of summarizing the what that has happened in the last 6 months. But today we have a bit more time, and I'd like us to try and distill that down a little bit and start talking about why we are seeing the types of threats that we are seeing today. So to put it another way, I want to help you to see the forest and not the trees in this case. So a lot happens, as I said, in those 6 months, and if you focus in on individual incidents or like look at the tree, you'll miss the bigger picture of what's actually happening. But when you grasp that bigger picture and you can understand the major trends that are happening here, it all becomes a lot simpler to actually manage. You just see new attacks as slight updates on the previous ones. So with that, in our report, we outlined 4 megatrends. The first one is ransomware, which should be a surprise to pretty much nobody here. Next up, we have malicious attacks across the network, which primarily at the moment especially is going to involve attacks in the cloud. Then we have APT campaigns, or nation states, if you like. And finally, the emerging field of AI and the risks that come from something like that. So let's go through each of these. We'll talk a little bit about what's happening in that space and then drill down to that why it's actually happening. And I'll spend a little bit more time on the ransomware side because it's the biggest threat of today, and on the emerging risks of AI because that's probably the biggest threat of tomorrow. But we'll make sure that the cloud and APT get some love along the way as well. Okay, so first up, good old ransomware. In our report, we drew in lots of different information on this. We looked at the top ransomware threat over the last year, which had been primarily Lockbit for a long time, from our own data. If you look at also the leak data from these ransomware and the kind of market share of which ransomware group leaked the most organization data, Lockbit also high up there, slight difference in the other groups. And then when we look at the targeting of different industries, you see the likes of banking and technology and governments and so on. But you'll find the actual targeting information isn't actually that useful, and I'll explain why in just a minute here. But you can generally say that larger organizations are being the ones most affected in our data. So overall, this report helps give a good understanding of the technical trends we see in cybercrime and ransomware. We can complement that by looking to third-party reports. For example, Chainalysis are a company that do very good analysis of the financial side of ransomware, looking at the blockchain and so on. And in their half-year report, they called out a couple of findings. One in particular is that ransomware victims in the first half of the year had paid $460 million in ransoms. So that is the largest amount over any 6-month period to date. However, at the same time, the percentage of people paying ransoms was at the lowest value. It was 28% of people paying ransoms. And the median value, or kind of like the average, not quite, right, was $199,000 per ransom in 2023. But in June 2024, that had changed to $1.5 million. So all of that put together means that very much like how we predicted in a report that Trend Micro put out at the end of 2023, we are seeing a rise of attacks on the biggest companies, the ones with the most money to pay out these groups. But you can't treat all ransomware the exact same. It's a bit like saying all shops in the retail industry work the exact same way. So we have, so in the retail industry, you would have some brands that are high value but low volume, and you'd have other ones that are low value but high volume. So think like Louis Vuitton handbags versus kind of cheaper, clothing, right? So what this is saying is that in the ransomware world, that kind of luxury brand level is the one currently dominating. And you might think comparing ransomware to different retail companies like this doesn't make a lot of sense. But not all ransomware is the same. There's different business models. And we've written extensively about this over a couple of different papers we did. So some ransomware takes very much a volume-based business, something like a trawler, right? They try to compromise as many victims around the world as they possibly can, and they make a small amount of money out of each of those victims. And the ones that they can't automate and handle, they just throw them away, right? They try to make as much as possible. The alternative to this is, of course, very targeted in nature. Well, not some targeted, but very patient and individualized attacks, where they try to land one really big fish and then make a lot of profit from that one individual one that they came after. So kind of this is a bit more like the high-touch businesses, like if you've ever gone to an Apple store and they take time with you and things like that, right? So you can think of ransomware groups also a bit like companies. They regularly start out a bit like a startup, and then over time they add extra departments. They add, for example, sales and support, and even HR eventually into their setups. And even as they grow, each ransomware business, if you compare it to a legitimate one, essentially have tiny bottom lines. It doesn't cost them much to do this. They have massive amounts of profit as well, and they're just trying to drive that revenue up for themselves year on year. One misconception of ransomware is targeting. So sometimes when we look at these stats, we see certain industries are more affected, or certain regions are more affected by ransomware. But in reality, that's not actually how ransomware works. I described it as highly individualized or high touch, but I didn't say highly targeted, because that's not actually what ransomware criminals are doing. If anybody saw the presentation from my colleagues Myra and Stephen about the English-speaking underground, you'll know that there's marketplaces exist where people can go and buy access to compromised companies. And those markets don't exist like something like Amazon that you might be more familiar with, where you can go and type in the exact company that you want to have access to, and hey, presto, you have it. They're much more like this. They're more like a farmer's market, where you go along and one person's like, here's the fresh veg I have today. Someone else is like, this is what we caught, these are the fish we have, and so on. And you look around and you buy whatever the best is that are available on that given day, right? So that is much more how ransomware works. So it's not true targeting, it's more selective on what's available in the market. Thankfully, though, it's not all doom and gloom in this space. We have had a number of big successes, 3 in particular this year, from law enforcement, 2 of which Trend Micro were involved with. The first one is Operation Kronos, which is actually the dismantling and disruption of the Lockbit ransomware group. And here, law enforcement actually turned the model of the group on their heads. They seized the leak site of the group and then published on their own leak site details of the gang themselves. Some of their identities, their Bitcoin wallets, how the code worked, all that sort of stuff. They also named the author, Dmitry Kurashev, and put a very large bounty out for the arrest of this individual. Incidentally, Dmitry is also wanted by Apple, who want to explain to him the correct way to wear an AirPod. Other cases, we had Operation Endgame, which was by far the biggest takedown of botnets in recent history. And you can see the 6 most affected botnets here on either side of me. And this is key because all of these families actually prop up the ransomware ecosystem. So when you get affected by ransomware, it's normally one of these 6 or somebody like them that had initial access to your computer and then resold it to these groups. So it had a very large impact and changed how they did business. We also had Operation Stargrew, which was the takedown of the lab host phishing as a service provider, which you can see here Trend were also involved in. And in this case, they not only took down the site, they also arrested the admin just before he got on a plane to leave the country. And police played some friendly knocks on the door to people all around the world, seizing money, laptops, and so on. But this service is a tricky one to actually affect completely. It had 2,000 users, and we know that there was at least one other admin. So we knew that when we arrested this individual, there's a good chance the service can come back up again in a couple of hours by the other admins. So what we needed to do was destroy the actual brand of the actual organization. So how do you do that? Well, quick show of hands, if I can see. Who here has a Spotify account? Anyone? A couple of people? Right. So if you have a Spotify account, you've probably come across the idea of Spotify Wrapped. It's essentially at the end of the year to give you some statistics on the types of music that you listen to over that year. It mightn't look like it because I don't have cool long black hair, but I'm actually a metalhead, so mine are all like crazy weird metal bands, right? So law enforcement did the same thing, but their own version of it that they call Lab Host Wrapped. And I'm going to show you a video that they sent exclusively to all 2,000 of those criminals.
Welcome to your Lab Host Wrapped, your recap of all the data we have about you.
Are we playing? And it's gone. Let's try that again. No, we'll go back. We try one more time. Can we play? Okay, I'll explain it. So, this is effectively they went through and they had statistics on each part of the activity of this group. So they showed how often the people logged in every year, the domains that they registered in the phishing service. They called out all the IP addresses that they logged in from. And they did it in a very kind of Spotify style, which showed statistics and really freaked out the users about the amount of information that the service themselves had been actually gathering on them. And it ended in the end by saying that Lab Host as a service was gone now, and unfortunately you're going to have to go find another phishing service. What law enforcement also did was they contacted each of those users over Telegram, which is how you interacted with the bot. And they gave them the option to actually confess their crimes. Because 2,000 users is an enormous amount of paperwork if you're in law enforcement. And it would make everybody's life so much easier if these people would just confess to their crimes. Now, needless to say, not many people responded very kindly when being asked to give up their details. But what did end up happening was that Lab Host as a service did give up. The other admin simply surrendered, gave up, and the service has not come back since. So it's had a very positive effect in this place. However, so the good guys are having some success too, right? But people are still being victimized every day of the week in cybercrime. However, being honest, that's always going to be the case. If I come back here next year and get a chance to give a talk, or in 10 years, or I don't know, I'm being propped up by some sort of weird AI exoskeleton in 100 years, it's going to be the exact same. This will always be the case. So what you see in cybercrime is really a predator-prey type situation. In any ecosystem that's actually in good balance, there's more than enough prey, if you like, so organizations in our case, that the predators will never really go hungry and die out. And every time they attack one herd, for example, that herd then in turn learns and improves its defenses over time, and it becomes harder to attack. And then over time, some of that knowledge decays. And the attackers move on to another herd and another one and so on. And attackers tend also to go after the weaker ones, right, in the animal kingdom. And it's very much the same in the cybercrime world as well. So as bad as all this sounds, I think the equilibrium at the moment between attackers and defenders is not terrible in the world of actual cybercrime. So the odds of some organization being attacked today by cybercrime are very, very high. However, the odds of it being your organization are actually statistically quite low, especially if you've got any sort of decent security in place. So in that setup, the balance should be just challenging enough that the attacker has to constantly evolve their methods of attack, and us as defenders are constantly defending or upgrading our defenses. That's actually a healthy place to be. It's only when the balance gets out of whack with each other, which is kind of the case at the moment in ransomware, that we really need to do something about it as an industry. So next up, we have vulnerabilities in the cloud in particular. So looking at risk events coming from network intrusions in 2024, we saw that cloud attacks were by far the most common here. So why are these attacked? Well, they're very easy to spin up for admins, but they're quite tricky to actually secure if you don't know what you're doing. So what sort of attacks are happening in the cloud today? Well, you have nation states who are tending to compromise the cloud and then use them to hide where they are coming from in attacks, but you also have financial criminals. And financial criminals will primarily focus on crypto mining, which we've written some papers on this space. At any given time, there will be a different number of attack groups out there doing crypto mining. Some will be quite advanced in nature. This is one group called 8220. It's got quite a complex kill chain to it. They use heavy obfuscation. The whole thing runs in memory. It's actually pretty tricky to detect. Others will be less sophisticated, but no less successful. This is from a group called Team TNT. It's a translated version of their mining script. And while you can't read it, I will call out some interesting details here. So they mention up here that their goal is to keep the internet safe, which seems a bit strange. They want to keep hackers away from your organization. And if them compromising all of your cloud instances seems like a strange way for them to do that, well, they say, well, how else could they get famous and make it themselves rich? Also, they point out that if you do get infected by this group, don't worry, just tell them. They will go and uninstall and clean up the script for you. That's a level of customer service you don't get from your average Russian ransomware group, let me tell you, right? So, if all of this kind of seems strange, that you have a group that thinks they're making the world safer by literally hacking organizations, and you might think to yourself, the individual behind this must be on a special cocktail of drugs for that to make any sense in their head, I can tell you, the person actually is. Regardless of this, though, these attacks have massive impact on both the cloud customers and the actual providers of the cloud. So for the customers, these can lead to tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of costs per month from the fees from all that mining before they get discovered. And in the case of the cloud providers, there's actually a new type of crypto mining called Chia mining. It uses something called proof of time and space instead of proof of work, which Bitcoin uses. And it can actually shrink the lifetime of a solid-state drive, like a hard drive, from 5 to 10 years down to 40 days that they have to swap these out and toss them out. So all of that shows that these mining groups are learning and improving over time. And today's cloud instances are poorly protected in general. So to make matters worse, these mining groups in the cloud are a bit like the kind of canary, if you like that analogy, where they could smell the gas coming, right? If these groups can get onto your network, literally anybody can get onto your network. Moving forward, we have the whole area of APT, or nation-state attacks, and Trend have published many different publications in this area over the last year, and groups called Erthunden and Luska and others. And unsurprisingly, these attacks line up very much with the motivations of a bunch of nation-states around the world, especially those involved in high-end sophisticated attacks, like, for example, Russia against Ukraine, China against Taiwan, and so on. And if you ever want to know what an APT group will strategically target next, it's actually really easy to know. Just go read any of these documents. So these are all the official military doctrines or 5-year plans of countries like Russia, China, United States, NATO, and so on. And at the end of the day, an APT group is just really a military unit or a foreign intelligence unit, and they're following the directions that their country have given them. And at a technical level, what we have seen APT doing more recently is targeting routers. And we had a talk from Stephen on this earlier today. The reason behind that is these routers, when you think about them in your home, they're an always-on device, they're very easy to compromise, they effectively never get patched or fixed up, and they're also a gateway to the home, which nowadays is also the gateway to the enterprise. So to put it another way, they're an eternal botnet. And nation-states in particular like using these to hide where they're coming from when they're carrying out their attacks. So case in point, if you're imagining being a Philippines government service and you see a login coming to you from somewhere in Metro Manila, is that one of your employees that you would expect? Or is that a nation-state tunneling through their router that you wouldn't have expected, but whose like IP ranges you would have blocked? And finally, for our 4 key areas, we have AI attacks and risks. And there's been a lot of doom and gloom in kind of the world around AI. But what have we actually seen criminals using it for? Well, we saw them using it to write better code and develop malware. We saw them using it to get better at phishing attacks and make sure they're more localized to certain countries, right? And we've also seen a lot of uses of deepfakes. So deepfakes to get people to invest in things at high volume or very targeted deepfake attacks and things like this. And you can do entire talks on this. But the key here is it's not really earth-shattering what these groups have come up with from an AI point of view. It's just a little bit better than what they were doing before. And there's much more they actually could be doing in this space. So just to give one example, a whole idea of digital twin spearfishing. So in this, you have biometrics, right, and deepfakes are very good at impersonating the physical look of a person. But when you add generative AI and LLMs to the picture, trained on enough public and private data about you, they can impersonate your personality, your writing style, how you speak, how you interact with people, and so on. So this picture, by the way, is of of a digital twin robot. I'll let it up to you to decide which of these you think is Professor Ishiguro from Japan. And then spear phishing attacks carried out with a malicious digital twin will be incredibly hard for us to detect with modern means, right? So if well executed, content detection won't work. Writing style detection won't work. AI detection will even have a hard time with these. And all of that has a very low barrier for entry for criminals if they want to dial that up and target many people around the world. And we're already seeing lots of these digital twin chatbots exist for you to interact with celebrities or partners, and I use inverted commas there for that one, even dead loved ones as well, right? All of these. In fact, I'd argue that we actually have more to worry about right now in AI from legitimate uses of AI that are misconfigured than the malicious usage. So take, for example, data leakage. So when we talk about data leakage in AI, I'm not talking here about like the models leaking data or leaking data from your company. What about internal data leakage? So you take some AI product and you train it up on your internal data and you give some app to your employees that lets them search for the common kind of questions that they would have internally in the organization. And then suddenly it starts giving out salary data or that team that you were going to make redundant or the merger you were about to do. All because you hadn't realized some SharePoint folder somewhere was also connected to the network and that got indexed as well. So those type of things are big risks coming. And with all these concerns about what criminals could be doing being a lot less than what they're actually doing, why is that? Well, we have what we call the 3 main rules of cybercrime internally in Trend Micro. So the first one is criminals want an easy life. That's the entire point of being a criminal, right? You do it because it's easier than the hard-working alternative. Secondly, for criminals to adopt anything, the return of investment needs to be substantially better than everything else on the market. Otherwise, they won't adopt it. And right now, ransomware is very, very popular. And third is criminals is an evolution, not a revolution for them. They only change when they really have to. Only a few criminal organizations really have sunk costs into like R&D with the hope that they'll gain something in the future. So all that means that criminals primarily focus on what is easy to do and are actually much slower to innovate and change, which is why I think they're at a major disadvantage going into the current changes in AI. So AI, I think, is going to bring a lot more good for us as the defenders. We are going to see things like AI digital assistants, that if you're doing an investigation, they can cut down days of work into only a few hours for you by going through logs. Big data analysis will really help us with attack predictions and figuring out kill chains and things like this. And individualized learning will help us bridge those cyber skill gaps that we have in security today. And as an industry, we're investing billions of dollars into AI while the criminals are barely getting started. So I'll finish up almost with one other story for AI to give you an idea of the scale of its effect on humanity. And this has actually nothing to do with our industry, but it is far too cool to leave out. So this is in the field of medicine. So in medicine, one of the most promising ways of developing new drugs and checking diseases is something called protein folding. You don't need to know how it works, but essentially, there have been 150,000 of these different proteins found through a variety of different techniques. And a rule of thumb is it takes one PhD researcher 4 to 5 years to uncover one of these structures. The problem is, we know that there is 200 million of these structures out there in the world to be discovered. Fast forward to 2022, and the Google AlphaFold project managed to unearth and discover all 200 million of these proteins. So to put that another way, that is 1 billion years of PhD research carried out in a single year. If that doesn't tell you the kind of level of impact AI can have on our industry and everything else, I don't know what does. So, to do a bit of a recap and finish up here, remember the key findings of the report. the top 4 trends that we are seeing in terms of ransomware, APT, what were the other ones? Cloud and AI. Also remember the 3 rules of being a cyber criminal. That's not actually, by the way, advice to follow these if you want to be a cyber criminal, but that's what they do. And most of all, remember to think of the why of all of this, the underlying reasons. Because when you do that and you start to see the forest and not the trees, you won't be overwhelmed anymore by all the different evolutions that are happening. And this whole cybersecurity world really will just be a walk in the park. Thank you very much, everybody, and pass it over.
Thank you very much, Bob.